Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The name Agatha Collins might not be familiar to most, but in certain corners of Harlan County, Kentucky, it still evokes a peculiar silence when mentioned. According to county records dated 1880, Agatha lived alone in a cabin nestled deep within the shadow of Pine Mountain, roughly 7 miles from the nearest settlement. What makes her case particularly unsettling isn't just what allegedly occurred, but how thoroughly the official narrative contradicts the local accounts that survived through generations of oral history. The few surviving photographs of the region from that era show a landscape of dense forest and jagged ridgelines, a place where a person could easily disappear, by choice or otherwise. In March of 1880, a traveling merchant by the name of Mordecai Quinn reported something unusual about the widow's property. The windows, normally kept immaculately clean despite the remote location, had been covered with what appeared to be layers of animal hides, sewn together in patterns that made little practical sense. Quinn's official statement, preserved in the county records, described these coverings as arranged in a manner suggesting something beyond mere utility, symbols or letters of a kind I do not recognize. This might have been dismissed as the eccentric behavior of a mountain woman, except for what the merchant claimed to have heard, a sound that, according to his sworn statement, weren't human, weren't animal, but somewhere in between, like a woman crying and a panther screaming at once. Quinn, by all accounts a practical man not given to flights of fancy, was so disturbed by the experience that he rode through the night to reach the settlement and report what he'd found, despite the considerable dangers of mountain travel after dark. This report marks the beginning of what would become known in local historical circles as the Collins Incident, though it wouldn't be formally documented until decades later. What's particularly notable about Quinn's account is what he chose not to include, details that would only emerge in his personal correspondence 50 years after his death, when his grandson discovered letters hidden in a family Bible. The settlement of Brookhaven sat in a narrow valley between towering ridges, a collection of no more than 30 wooden structures and a single church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east. According to tax records from 1877, Agatha Collins had been a respected member of the community following the death of her husband, Zachariah Collins, a moderately successful trapper and hunter who supplied pelts to merchants as far away as Lexington. The county registry notes that following Zachariah's death from what was described as mountain fever in the winter of 1876, Agatha continued to manage their property with remarkable efficiency. A rare daguerreotype photograph from 1877, now held in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, shows a stern-faced woman with high cheekbones and eyes that seem to look through rather than at the camera. She stands beside a cabin door, one hand holding what appears to be a skinning knife, her posture suggesting not just survival but a certain defiance. Neighbors' accounts, preserved in a 1934 oral history project conducted by the Kentucky Historical Society, described her as stern but fair, uncommonly self-reliant, and not given to the vapors or hysteria common in widowed ladies. Cordelia Blackburn, who lived 3 miles down ridge from the Collins property, recalled, "Agatha knew things most women weren't supposed to know: how to track game, how to negotiate with traders, which plants healed and which harmed. Zachariah taught her everything instead of keeping her ignorant like most men did their wives. Some found that unnatural, but others respected it." The Collins property produced enough surplus vegetables, medicinal herbs, and preserved goods to maintain regular trade with the settlement. What's particularly notable from these accounts is that Agatha was one of the few women in the region who regularly ventured into the deeper, uncharted sections of the mountain forests alone, collecting rare herbs that fetched higher prices with traveling medicine salesmen. A ledger from Hargrove's general store shows consistent transactions with Widow Collins through 1879, with no indication of anything unusual. The last recorded transaction, dated November 12, 1879, lists purchases that suggest ordinary preparation for winter: salt, coffee, ammunition, and lamp oil. This normal pattern of behavior makes what followed all the more disturbing. The winter of 1879-1880 was documented as particularly harsh in eastern Kentucky. Weather records from the period, though limited, indicate unusually heavy snowfall that isolated many mountain communities for weeks at a time. A meteorological report from Lexington describes it as the most severe winter in living memory, with temperatures dropping to unprecedented lows and snowdrifts reaching the eaves of some buildings. For those living in remote mountain cabins, such conditions didn't merely represent discomfort, they created a struggle for survival that tested both practical skills and mental resilience. The first disruption to Agatha's routine came in January 1880, when she failed to appear for the monthly church gathering, something she had never missed since her husband's funeral. According to the testimony of Prudence Hargrove, wife of the store owner, "We thought nothing of it at first, given the snow, but when February came and went with no sign of her, some began to whisper." These whispers, initially concerned, gradually took on a darker tone. Jebediah Hargrove, the store owner, reportedly commented to several customers that the widow had been acting strangely during her last visit, though when pressed for details, he described nothing more suspicious than her purchasing more ammunition than usual and asking questions about animal tracks that didn't match known predators in the region. A letter from Reverend Sutton to a colleague in Lexington, dated February 15, 1880, mentions growing concerns about the spiritual welfare of one of our more isolated parishioners, though he doesn't name Agatha directly. It wasn't until March, when the merchant Mordecai Quinn made his discovery, that anyone had seen or heard from the widow in over 2 months. Following Quinn's report, a small party consisting of the local constable and 2 men from Brookhaven made the difficult journey to the Collins property. What they found, according to the constable's report filed in Harlan County records, was a property in disarray, though not abandoned. The cabin stood, but something about it seemed fundamentally wrong. The carefully tended garden had been left to winter's mercy, without the usual preparations. A root cellar door hung open, its contents scattered as though searched through hastily. More concerning were the tracks found circling the cabin, some appearing human, others belonging to what the constable described as a large mountain cat, though unusually deformed in a way he couldn't properly articulate. In his private notes, later donated to the County Historical Society, he added, "The prints seemed to change from human to feline and back again, as though someone were playing an elaborate trick. Yet the snow was undisturbed between prints, making such deception seemingly impossible." The most troubling detail, however, was what they found inside the cabin. Walls covered with charcoal drawings depicting a woman transforming into something with claws and teeth, and a journal written in what appeared to be Agatha's hand, but with increasingly erratic penmanship. The last legible entry, according to the constable's report, simply read, "It's calling me to the high ridge. I must go to understand." Despite clear evidence of distress and possible danger, the search party spent less than an hour at the property before departing. The constable's report concludes with a recommendation that the situation be monitored. Yeah, but no immediate action was taken to locate the missing woman. The community's explanation came swiftly and conveniently. Mountain sickness, some called it, a term often used to describe the mental deterioration that sometimes affected those who lived in extreme isolation, Others whispered about forest vapors or cave air that could addle the mind. The local preacher, Jeremiah Sutton, spoke of temptations that find the lonely more easily than the embraced. But most revealing was the immediate invocation of the Wampus cat legend. For generations, Appalachian communities had told stories of a half-woman, half-mountain cat that stalked the remote ridges. According to folklore documented by anthropologists in the early 20th century, the Wampus cat was said to be a woman who disguised herself in a mountain lion skin to spy on the men's hunting rituals, only to become cursed and transformed into a creature trapped between human and feline form. The legend typically served as a cautionary tale about women overstepping their proper place, a theme that resonated strongly in the strictly gender-divided society of 19th century Appalachia. In a community account recorded in 1954, an elderly resident of Brookhaven recalled, "Folks were quick to say the Wampus got to the widow's mind. Easier than admitting what might really have happened up there." This resident, who requested anonymity even decades after the events, added, "I remember my father and the other men speaking in hushed tones about the Collins woman. There was fear there, but not of her, more like fear of what she represented." Donchum. What's striking in reviewing these accounts is how quickly the community moved to normalize what was happening. Records show that no official search was conducted for Agatha despite her disappearance. The constable's report concludes with a simple note: Widow Collins appears to have succumbed to isolation and superstition, property to be monitored for her return. This perfunctory dismissal of a community member's evident distress speaks volumes about the era's approach to mental deterioration, and perhaps about a collective desire not to look too closely at troubling matters. Most puzzling is the absence of certain expected responses: no formation of search parties, no request for assistance from neighboring communities, no official documentation of a missing person. It was as though Brookhaven had silently agreed that Agatha Collins had simply ceased to exist, and that this was somehow the natural order of things. Spring arrived, and with it, a strange quiet settled over the matter of Agatha Collins. Her name appears in church prayer records through April 1880, then abruptly stops. The property remained untouched, as though held in a state of suspension. According to county tax records, no attempt was made to claim or redistribute the land, unusual for the time when unclaimed property was quickly absorbed. A petition dated June 1880 from 3 Brookhaven residents requested permission to retrieve personal items they claimed were on loan to Agatha, but this was denied by the county clerk with a curious note: property to remain undisturbed pending resolution of the Collins matter. What this resolution might entail was never specified. The tax records show that the property continued to be listed under Agatha's name until 1885, when it was reclassified as abandoned, owner deceased, without any documentation of when or how this death had been confirmed. Meanwhile, local accounts describe a change in how people interacted with the mountain itself. Hunting parties began to avoid the ridge where the Collins cabin stood. Parents warned children not to wander in that direction. A school teacher named Abigail Winchester, who taught in Brookhaven from 1881 to 1883, wrote in her private correspondence, "The children draw strange pictures, a woman with cat eyes or a cat with a woman's hands. When asked, they say it's the widow who hunts at night. The parents grow uncomfortable when I inquire further." A traveling minister who visited Brookhaven in autumn 1880 wrote in his journal, "Found the settlement gripped by an unspoken dread. When pressed, they speak of a widow who went mad, but fall silent when asked for details. One senses a community bound by a shared secret." The physical environment itself seemed to reflect this psychological weight. Photographs from an 1882 geological survey show the section of forest surrounding the Collins property in an unusual state of overgrowth, as though nature itself was working to reclaim and obscure whatever had happened there. The survey notes mention anomalous vegetation patterns and accelerated decomposition of man-made structures, though the surveyors attributed this to unique soil conditions rather than anything more mysterious. Sound became a recurring motif in accounts from this period. Multiple sources mentioned strange calls from the ridge at night, described variously as a woman calling for help or an animal in distress. The settlement's shared silence about these sounds speaks to a collective agreement to ignore what couldn't be easily explained. Most telling is an entry in Reverend Sutton's church records from September 1880. Congregants report disturbing sounds from the North Ridge. I have counseled that these are merely natural phenomena, the wind through the rock formations or the cries of normal forest creatures. We must resist the temptation to assign supernatural significance to that which can be explained through God's natural order. Natai, this official dismissal of community concerns, suggests a deliberate effort to redirect attention away from the Collins property and whatever might have occurred there. It wasn't until 1887 that any official record again mentions Agatha Collins directly. A county medical examiner's report found in state archives during a 1958 historical research project contains this brief but chilling entry. Remains discovered in Hollow Tree approximately 2 miles from the Collins homestead, identified through personal effects as belonging to Agatha Collins, widow. Cause of death undetermined, due to state of remains. Notable observations: unusual patterns of scoring on remaining bone fragments consistent with animal activity, though not matching known predator patterns in the region. This clinical description masks what must have been a deeply unsettling discovery. More revealing is what the report doesn't contain. No mention of formal identification by community members, no record of a proper burial, and no follow-up investigation. It's as if the discovery was deliberately minimized, a footnote rather than a resolution. The report does mention that among the personal effects used to identify the remains was a silver locket containing a daguerreotype of Zachariah Collins and a lock of hair. According to Brookhaven church records, Agatha was known to wear this locket daily after her husband's death, never removing it even while working. The medical examiner noted that the locket was found clasped in what remained of the right hand, suggesting it was held rather than worn at time of death. This detail raises disturbing questions about Agatha's final moments. Was she looking at her husband's image as she died? Was she attempting to protect this cherished item? Or was the locket deliberately placed with her remains after death? Perhaps as some form of ritual or sentiment, but what makes this case truly disturbing is not the fact of Agatha's death, but what was discovered decades later. In 1931, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky conducting research on Appalachian folk beliefs discovered a journal allegedly belonging to Agatha Collins in the possession of Silas Hargrove, grandson of the original store owner. The journal had apparently been preserved by the family for decades, but never shared with authorities. The student, Josephine Waller, made extensive notes about the journal's contents before it was mysteriously lost during her return journey to Lexington. According to Waller's research notes, archived at the university, the journal documented Agatha's experiences from November 1879 through approximately February 1880. The early entries describe increasing isolation due to heavy snow, but maintain a tone of practical resilience. On November 30th, Agatha wrote, 3 feet of snow overnight. The pass to Brookhaven will be closed for weeks. I have enough preserved food to last until spring if necessary, and the rifle for fresh meat. Zachariah taught me well how to endure the mountain's harshest season. By December, however, the entries take a disturbing turn. According to Waller's notes, Agatha began documenting visitations after discovering unusual tracks in the snow circling her cabin. Initially, she attributed these to a mountain lion, but became convinced that the creature was watching her specifically. An entry from December 21st, 1879 reads, "It watches from the tree line at dusk, not like a hungry animal, but like something that knows me. Today I saw its eyes reflecting the lantern light too high off the ground for a normal cat, almost at the height of a man." Later entries describe Agatha's growing certainty that the creature was attempting to communicate with her. "I hear my name in its calls now, not spoken, but somehow there in the sound. Last night it scratched at the door for hours. When I finally found the courage to look out at dawn, I found no claw marks, but words carved into the wood, 'Join us,' Art Wheats." Waller's analysis suggested that Agatha was likely suffering from ergot poisoning, a fungal contamination of grain that can cause hallucinations, or possibly from the effects of certain local plants with psychoactive properties. The journal entry for January 2, 1880, details Agatha's discovery of strange markings on trees surrounding her property, symbols she initially couldn't identify, but later came to believe were the language of the mountain itself. She described spending hours copying these symbols into her journal and becoming convinced they contained a message specifically for her. By mid-January, the journal entries become increasingly erratic, with sudden changes in handwriting, pages filled with repetitive symbols, and passages written in what appears to be a substitution cipher that Waller was unable to decode. But what makes this case particularly unsettling is what followed these delusions. The final pages of the journal, according to Waller's notes, contain increasingly fragmented writings about becoming what I was always meant to be and joining with the spirit that has chosen me. Agatha described dreams in which she ran through the forest on all fours, faster and more alive than I've ever been. She wrote of heightened senses, being able to smell approaching storms days in advance, hearing conversations from the settlement despite being miles away, seeing clearly in total darkness. The last coherent entry, dated approximately February 3, 1880, reads, "I understand now. The hunger isn't evil, it's necessary. What I must do is necessary. They've been watching me because they knew all along what I would become. Zachariah tried to warn me before they took him. The marks on his body weren't from fever, they were from them. Now I see the truth about Brookhaven, about what happens in the caves. Tonight I go to the high ridge to complete what has begun." The remaining pages reportedly contained only drawings, crude sketches of human-animal hybrid figures, and maps of the surrounding area, with certain locations marked with an X. Of particular interest was a detailed drawing of what appeared to be a cave entrance, accompanied by symbols similar to those Agatha claimed to have found carved into trees. Waller's research was never published, and her notes were filed away and forgotten until they were rediscovered during a university archive digitization project in 1963. By then, Waller herself had left academia and could not be located for further comment. The story might have remained buried in academic archives if not for what happened in the autumn of 1943. A hunting party from Harlan County, venturing into the now abandoned area once known as Brookhaven, the settlement having been gradually deserted following the closure of local mining operations in the early 1900s, discovered the remains of the Collins cabin. According to their account, published in the Harlan Daily Enterprise, they were drawn to the location by an unusual sound like a woman crying. The hunter who first heard the sound, Vernon Tate, described it as coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, so real I would have sworn someone was standing right beside me, though I was alone at the time. Mas, what they found was the stone foundation and chimney of the cabin, the wooden structure having long since collapsed. One of the hunters, Ezekiel Foster, described finding a small metal box beneath what would have been the floorboards, containing several items, a wedding band, a small leather-bound book with illegible water-damaged pages, and most notably, A carefully preserved letter dated January 15, 1880, addressed to whoever finds this. The contents of this letter were partially published in the newspaper, though the full text was never made public. The published excerpt reads, "By the time you find this, they will have created their story about what happened to me. They will speak of madness, of the Wampus cat, of a widow who lost her mind to loneliness. What they will not speak of is what was done to me, or why I was truly banished to this mountain. I have discovered their secret, you see. What happens in the caves beneath Brookhaven, what the men of this settlement truly worship. They think isolating me here will silence me. Perhaps it has, but this truth remains." The remainder of the letter was described as too damaged to decipher by the newspaper, though rumors persisted that the content was deliberately suppressed. According to Foster's later account, given to a local historian in 1957, the letter continued, "Wysejabate does. This truth remains. They are not men as we understand men to be. What they become in the dark of the moon is something older than our Christian faith, older than these mountains themselves. Zechariah discovered their secret hunts, their transformations, their sacrifices. For this they poisoned him slowly, making it appear as mountain fever. I was to be next, but something unexpected happened. Their ritual intended to drive me mad has instead opened my eyes. I am changing, yes, but not as they intended. I am becoming something they fear." The newspaper editor, Thaddeus Blackburn, reportedly decided against publishing the full text after consulting with several prominent local families, descendants of original Brookhaven residents who had relocated to Harlan proper. What's particularly noteworthy is that within a week of this publication, the newspaper printed a retraction, claiming the letter was likely a hoax planted by pranksters seeking to perpetuate mountain superstitions. De Foster, who had discovered the letter, suddenly changed his account, claiming he had misremembered significant details and suggesting that the metal box had likely been placed there recently, rather than being a genuine historical artifact. The other hunters similarly distanced themselves from their original statements. The metal box and its contents were supposedly given to the County Historical Society, but no record of these items appears in their acquisition logs from that period. The investigation into both Agatha Collins and the history of Brookhaven settlement might have ended there, if not for the persistence of a regional historian named Zechariah Booth. In 1952, Booth began researching disappearances in eastern Kentucky between 1870 and 1900, initially focusing on mining accidents and frontier violence. His research led him to the Collins case, which he found unusually well documented in some aspects and suspiciously lacking in others. Booth's field notes, preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, detail his journey to the former Brookhaven settlement and the Collins property in the summer of 1953. What he found challenges the conventional narrative surrounding Agatha Collins. According to Booth's notes, the area surrounding the former Collins cabin contained unusual stone formations that appeared partially man-made, arranged in what he described as a deliberate pattern, visible only when viewed from the ridge above. Aerial photographs taken by Booth show what appears to be a large, stylized animal figure, possibly feline, formed by strategically placed stones and controlled vegetation growth. This design, measuring approximately 60 feet in length, would not have been apparent to someone on the ground, raising questions about who created it and how. The figure resembles certain Native American earthworks found elsewhere in the United States, though no historical record exists of such structures in this region of Kentucky. More significant was his discovery of a small cave entrance approximately half a mile from the cabin site, concealed by decades of vegetation growth. Booth's initial exploration of the cave revealed evidence of human activity, tool marks on the walls, the remains of torches, and, most disturbingly, what appeared to be a carved stone altar in the deepest chamber. Laboratory analysis of residue found on this altar, conducted at Booth's request by the University of Kentucky, identified traces of both animal and human blood. Though the age of these samples could not be precisely determined, the cave walls bore carved symbols similar to those described in Agatha's journal, a series of interconnected lines and spirals that anthropologists consulted by Booth could not connect to any known cultural tradition. Most disturbing were the human remains. Booth discovered in a narrow side passage fragments of at least 3 skeletons showing signs of deliberate disarticulation and arrangement in a pattern that Booth described as ritualistic in nature. These remains were never officially documented or removed for proper burial, as Booth's subsequent attempts to interest authorities in his findings were unsuccessful. Booth's research took a darker turn when he began tracking down descendants of original Brookhaven residents. Most refused to speak with him, but one elderly woman, Hester Quinn, granddaughter of the merchant Mordecai Quinn, provided a testimony that contradicts the official record. According to Booth's interview notes, Hester Quinn claimed that Brookhaven had been founded not as a simple frontier settlement, but as a deliberate isolation of a group that had broken away from a larger community due to their unusual beliefs. She described a secret society that operated within the settlement, composed primarily of the male heads of families, who conducted rituals in the cave system beneath the ridge. These rituals allegedly involved blood sacrifice and invocations to entities they believed lived within the mountain itself. Quinn claimed that Agatha Collins had discovered these practices after her husband's death, which was not from natural causes as recorded, but a ritual sacrifice disguised as mountain fever. They gave him to the mountain, yet Quinn is quoted as saying, as they had given others before. But the widow was not supposed to know. According to Quinn, Zachariah Collins had been a member of the secret society, but had grown increasingly disturbed by the escalation of their practices, particularly the transition from animal to human sacrifice. His attempts to leave the group or expose them had resulted in his murder, disguised as illness. Quinn alleged that when Agatha threatened to expose the group, they employed a 2-pronged strategy, isolating her physically by gradually reducing contact, and psychologically by convincing her she was experiencing supernatural events. They would leave animal parts around her property. They would make sounds in the night that sounded almost human. They wore masks made from mountain lion skulls when they circled her cabin. I saw these masks as a child, hidden in my grandfather's storeroom. They wanted her to believe she was losing her mind, so that no one would believe her if she spoke. Most chilling was Quinn's claim that members of the settlement would wear animal skins during their rituals, including mountain lion pelts fitted with crude masks, creating the appearance of half-human, half-feline figures moving through the forest at night, the likely origin of Agatha's Wampus cat delusions. Quinn's testimony suggested that Agatha's journal entries about physical transformation were not merely hallucinations, but her mind's attempt to process the traumatic psychological warfare being conducted against her. Quinn concluded her testimony with a disturbing personal recollection. As a child, I once overheard my grandfather speaking with another man about the Collins woman. He said, "She became what we pretended to be." When I asked him years later what he meant, he refused to speak of it and forbade me from ever mentioning her name again. Booth's investigation came to an abrupt end in November 1953, when a fire destroyed his research office and most of his documentation. The fire was officially ruled accidental, though Booth himself expressed doubts in private correspondence. His research was never published, and he abandoned the project shortly thereafter, accepting a teaching position in Ohio. In a letter to a colleague dated 1956, Booth wrote, "Some secrets are buried too deep, protected too fiercely. I fear Agatha Collins will never receive justice, and the true history of Brookhaven will remain hidden. What troubles me most is not what I found, but what I suspect continues in other isolated communities to this day. The old ways didn't die, they merely adapted to avoid our modern scrutiny. In 1963, the construction of a new highway through eastern Kentucky necessitated archaeological surveys of several areas, including the former Brookhaven settlement. During these surveys, a team from the University of Tennessee discovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 7 individuals located approximately 1 mile from the former settlement center. Carbon dating placed these remains between 1870 and 1890. Analysis indicated that all 7 had died violently, with evidence of both bladed weapon wounds and what the archaeological report described as unusual post-mortem treatment of the remains. Most notably, several of the skeletons showed evidence of deliberate defleshing with tools and ritualistic arrangement of the bones. Forensic examination revealed that certain bones had been carefully removed from each skeleton, specifically the left femur and several finger bones, while others had been positioned in non-anatomical arrangements. The archaeological team also recovered several artifacts from the site, including silver jewelry, buttons, and personal items that suggested the deceased were not transients or outsiders, but members of the settlement itself. Of particular significance was the discovery of a silver pendant bearing the initials ZC, potentially linking one of the remains to Zachariah Collins, despite official records indicating he had been buried in the Brookhaven Cemetery after dying of natural causes. None of the remains could be positively identified, though comparative analysis with cemetery records indicated that these individuals were not among those officially documented as deceased and buried in the settlement's recorded graves. This discovery prompted a brief investigation by state authorities, but with the original settlement long abandoned and most direct descendants either deceased or relocated, the case was quietly filed away. The report concludes with a recommendation for further investigation into the social and religious practices of isolated Appalachian communities in the late 19th century, but no such study was ever commissioned. The highway construction proceeded as planned, and the site was paved over by the summer of 1964. What's particularly unsettling about this discovery is how it contextualizes Agatha Collins' experience, not as an isolated incident of mental deterioration, but potentially as part of a larger pattern of violence and secretive practices within the community. The archaeological report includes a curious footnote. Site shows evidence of periodic visitation and possible continued ritual activity as recently as the 1940s, suggesting cultural practices associated with this location persisted long after the settlement's abandonment. This observation raises the disturbing possibility that whatever occurred in Brookhaven didn't end with the settlement's dissolution, but continued in some form for decades afterward. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Collins case emerged in 1968, when a graduate student in folklore studies named Meredith Vance began researching the origins of the Wampus cat legend in eastern Kentucky. Vance's research, preserved in her unpublished dissertation at Ohio State University, uncovered a pattern that had gone previously unnoticed. By comparing local newspaper records, county death certificates, and church documents from 1850 to 1900, Vance identified at least 5 other cases across the Appalachian region with striking similarities to the Collins incident. Isolated women, often widows, who reported being stalked by creatures matching the Wampus cat description, followed by their disappearance or death under mysterious circumstances. These cases, scattered across Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee, shared several key elements. The women had recently experienced a loss that isolated them from their communities. They reported increasingly strange occurrences preceding their disappearance. Local authorities attributed their claims to mental deterioration, and their bodies, when found, showed unusual characteristics that were never fully explained. In each case, the women had recently experienced a loss or change that might have made them more vulnerable or isolated from their communities. In each case, local authorities attributed their claims to mental deterioration, mountain superstition, or women's hysteria. And in each case, subsequent investigation revealed unusual circumstances surrounding their deaths, bodies found in unlikely locations, evidence of extended survival in the wilderness, or unexplained delays in reporting their disappearances. The case of Mary Ann Blackwood in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, from 1862, particularly echoed the Collins incident. Blackwood, widowed after her husband died in a mining collapse, reported being stalked by a woman cat for weeks before her disappearance. Her remains were discovered a year later in a cave, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the stone. Local authorities ruled her death a suicide, despite evidence suggesting she had survived in the cave for months before dying. Most significantly, Vance discovered that in 3 of these 5 cases, including Agatha Collins, the women had been married to men who died under circumstances that, while officially attributed to accident or illness, contained inconsistencies when the records were closely examined. Vance noted that in each community where these incidents occurred, there were indications of unusual social structures, men's groups with no official documentation, regular gatherings in remote locations, and local legends about human-animal transformation that predated European settlement of the region. Vance's research suggested a disturbing possibility that the Wampus cat legend was being deliberately exploited as a cover for something much more human and malevolent, the systematic elimination of women who had become inconvenient or who had discovered something they were not meant to know. Her dissertation concluded, "The monster in these hills was never supernatural. The true horror lies in how effectively a community can silence those who threaten its secrets, and how folklore can be weaponized against the vulnerable." What appears at first glance to be isolated incidents of mental breakdown reveals itself upon closer examination to be a pattern of strategic elimination disguised as superstition. Vance's work received little attention outside academic circles, and she died in an automobile accident in 1969 before publishing her findings in a more accessible format. The circumstances of her death, a single vehicle accident on a straight stretch of road in clear weather, raised questions among her colleagues, though no formal investigation was conducted. Her research materials were archived at Ohio State University, where they remained largely forgotten until digital archiving efforts in the early 2000s. The final chapter of the Agatha Collins story came in 1969, when an elderly man named Obadiah Hargrove, claiming to be the great-grandson of the original Brookhaven store owner, approached the Kentucky Historical Society with what he described as family papers that need to be preserved. Among these documents was a leather folder containing what appeared to be original pages from Agatha Collins' journal, pages that had supposedly been lost decades earlier. Unlike the fragmentary notes preserved by previous researchers, these pages contained a more coherent narrative of Agatha's final weeks. They described her growing awareness that the strange occurrences around her cabin were not supernatural, but human in origin. The most revealing entry, dated January 28, 1880, reads, "I understand now that there is no Wampus cat. There never was. What stalks me wears human skin by day, and only dons the cat skin under cover of darkness. I have seen them now, gathered at the edge of my clearing. They wear the masks and pelts, but I recognize the eyes of men I once called neighbors. 3 nights ago, I saw Jebediah Hargrove himself standing at the tree line, wearing what appeared to be a mountain lion's skull over his face like a mask. They think I am terrified, broken by their games. They do not realize that in trying to drive me to madness, they have instead granted me clarity. I know why Zechariah had to die. I know what he discovered in the cave, And now I know too. They will come for me soon, thinking me weakened by fear and isolation. They do not understand that I have been preparing. The journal goes on to describe Agatha's systematic fortification of her cabin and her creation of various traps and weapons. She writes of mixing toxic plants into paste and coating arrowheads with the mixture. Most disturbing is her description of consuming small amounts of these same toxins herself, believing they were making her something other than human, something they cannot anticipate. The final entry, undated, but presumably from early February 1880, contains only this: "They are coming tonight. I hear them gathering in the trees. At least 7 men, perhaps more. They no longer bother to disguise their voices or movements. They believe me broken, helpless. I am ready. The doors are barred, but the window facing east is not. That is where they will enter, where the first trap awaits." If you are reading this, know that whatever story they tell about me is a lie. Look to the hollow oak on the north ridge. What I've hidden there will reveal everything. These pages were authenticated by handwriting experts, though their provenance remains questionable, given the circumstances of their appearance. What's particularly disturbing is that within a month of these documents being submitted to the Historical Society, they were reported missing from the archives. Obadiah Hargrove could not be located for further questioning, and some researchers have suggested that the name itself may have been a pseudonym. The hollow oak referenced in the journal has never been conclusively identified, despite several attempts by local historians. Whatever evidence Agatha may have preserved has either been lost to time or deliberately removed. In the decades since, the story of Agatha Collins has faded into regional folklore, occasionally resurfacing in collections of Appalachian ghost stories or academic studies of frontier justice. What remains deeply unsettling about this case, however, is not just what might have happened to one woman in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky, but what it reveals about how effectively communities can construct narratives to conceal uncomfortable truths. The official record presents Agatha Collins as a victim of her own mind, a woman whose isolation drove her to delusion and possibly violent action against herself. The evidence uncovered by subsequent investigations suggests a far more disturbing possibility: a woman who discovered something dangerous, who was systematically isolated, gaslighted, and ultimately silenced. Perhaps most troubling is how the Wampus cat legend itself appears to have been weaponized, a supernatural explanation deployed to discredit a very human threat. The case raises uncomfortable questions about historical treatment of women who defied convention, about the dynamics of isolated communities, and about how effectively certain stories can be buried. In 1992, a forest ranger working in what is now the Daniel Boone National Forest, which encompasses part of the former Brookhaven area, reported finding unusual claw marks on trees in a pattern that formed a rough circle approximately 50 feet in diameter. Within this circle, the ground had been recently disturbed in a manner suggesting deliberate digging, though no excavated items were found. The ranger reported hearing an unusual sound, like a woman's voice calling from a great distance, although no other hikers were registered in the area at the time. As recently as 2005, hikers in the region of the former Brookhaven settlement reported hearing unusual sounds like a woman crying or a big cat screaming near dusk. Local rangers attribute these sounds to mountain lions or the acoustics of the ridge amplifying normal forest sounds. Perhaps they're right, or perhaps, as Zachariah Booth suggested in his final notes on the case, some echoes never truly fade. They merely wait for someone willing to truly listen. The land where the Collins cabin once stood is now part of a state forest. No marker indicates what occurred there. No memorial acknowledges Agatha's existence. The records that might have provided definitive answers have been lost, destroyed, or deliberately obscured. All that remains is a story A story about a widow who claimed the Wampus cat made her do terrible things, when the true terror may have been what was done to her, in the name of preserving a community's darkest secrets. Today, nearly a century and a half after Agatha Collins vanished into the mists of Appalachian history, the region has changed dramatically. Highways cut through mountains once considered impenetrable. Smartphones receive signals in hollows where isolation was once absolute. Yet something of this story continues to resonate, perhaps because its central questions remain so relevant. Who do we believe when accounts conflict? Whose voices are preserved in official records and whose are silenced? What secrets might still lie buried in the dark hollows and ridges of our collective history? The transformation of the Wampus cat from a cautionary folktale about female transgression to a convenient explanation for eliminating threats reveals something profound about how power operates in isolated communities. The most effective control isn't always direct violence, but the manipulation of shared beliefs to discredit those who challenge the established order. In one of her final research notes, Meredith Vance wrote, "The most effective monsters are those we create together, not through superstition, but through collective silence." The case of Agatha Collins serves as a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing horror stories are not those featuring supernatural creatures or ghostly apparitions, but those that reveal the lengths to which ordinary people will go to protect their secrets and their power. The next time you drive through the winding mountain roads of Appalachia, passing small communities nestled in remote hollows, consider what stories might remain untold. What secrets might lie just beneath the surface of recorded history? And if you should hear strange sounds in the forest at dusk, something between a woman's cry and a mountain cat's scream, remember that the true source of terror may not be the unknown lurking in the darkness, but the familiar smiling in the light. For some secrets, like those of Brookhaven and Agatha Collins, the most terrifying aspect isn't what we know, but what we can never fully uncover, the truths that remain eternally just beyond our reach, echoing through the mountains like the cry of something that is neither fully human nor fully beast.